Something unusual is happening inside American newsrooms. At first it is subtle, a small shift, a feeling rather than a fact, a softer tone here, a warmer delivery there, a rhythm that feels less mechanical and more human. Words that once sounded sharp and formal now feel gentler. Sentences that used to rush forward now flow with calm intention. Announcements that once felt distant now feel personal, almost comforting. Most viewers would never think twice. News is news, after all. People tune in, listen, and move on with their day. But for those who pay attention, for those who truly listen, something has changed. The language feels different. The tone feels kinder. The delivery feels less like a script and more like a conversation. It is as if someone lifted the cold metal edge from the news and replaced it with warmth, with humanity. And that difference does not come from a new media strategy, or a wave of young broadcasters, or a sudden shift in American communication culture. No. That difference comes from a place millions of miles away, a chain of islands known for its culture of kindness, its people of hospitality, and its language shaped not just by rules, but by heart. The Philippines. Today, across the United States, thousands of journalists, anchors, and broadcasters are speaking differently, and many of them do not even realize it. Their tone, their pacing, their intentional pauses, their softness, all trace back to a communication style deeply rooted in Filipino English. What once seemed like just another variation of English is now quietly shaping how America communicates with its audience. This is not just an accent. It is not a trend. It is not a coincidence. It is a shift, a transformation, a silent revolution in the way news is spoken and received. And yet, most people have no idea it is happening. So how did a style of English born thousands of miles away in Southeast Asia find its way into the heart of American media? How did a communication approach once used in call centers and classrooms become the tone of trust for one of the world's largest broadcasting industries? And perhaps more importantly, what does this change reveal about the future of global communication? To understand the answer, to truly see how deep this transformation goes, we need to go back. Back before the cameras. Back before the teleprompters. Back before news became a global machine. We need to go back to where it all began. More than a century ago, when English first found its way into the Philippine Islands, it did not arrive as just a language. It arrived as a seed, small, unfamiliar, and foreign. Teachers from across the ocean stood in front of classrooms filled with children who spoke languages older than the colonizers who taught them. Ilocano, Kapampangan, Waray, Bisaya, Tagalog. English was new. But slowly, something remarkable happened. Filipinos did not just learn English, they transformed it. It became something unique. Not American, though Americans brought it. Not British, though it carried traces of British structure. Not neutral, though it could be understood anywhere in the world. It became something softer. Filipino English took on the spirit of the people speaking it. A culture known for hiya, gentleness, for pakikipagkapwa, connection, for respect woven into every sentence. And so the language evolved, not as a tool of authority, but as a bridge of understanding. Filipino English was never meant to intimidate. It was meant to welcome. It carried warmth. It carried courtesy. It carried a rhythm that sounded less like a lecture and more like a genuine conversation. It was the kind of English that felt like someone was talking with you, not talking at you. For decades, the world overlooked this version of English. It was considered too soft, too informal, too emotional. But while others dismissed it, Filipinos perfected it. They made it clear, so that anyone, no matter where they were from, could understand it. They made it calm, so conversations felt safe, approachable, human. They made it empathetic, not because someone told them to, but because that is the way Filipinos speak. Over time, Filipino English grew into something powerful. It became the backbone of call centers, serving every continent. It became the voice of international classrooms and global customer service. It became a sound the world subconsciously trusted. And years later, when American newsrooms were struggling, when audiences were disconnecting, when communication felt cold and distant, That same style, once brushed aside and underestimated, would become exactly what America needed. A reminder that communication is not just about speaking. It is about connecting. In the early 2000s, something began to shift inside America's media landscape. For decades, the news had been trusted. Anchors were seen as voices of authority, voices of certainty, voices people believed. But slowly, almost quietly, that trust began to fracture. Viewership was collapsing. Ratings fell year after year. Younger audiences turned away, uninterested. Older viewers felt disconnected. Millions of Americans started asking the same silent question. Why does the news no longer feel human? Anchors sounded too perfect, almost scripted. Every sentence felt calculated. Every word sounded controlled. Every delivery felt the same, sharp, fast, emotionless. The news had become polished to the point of sterility. People still wanted information, yes, but they wanted it to feel real, authentic, human. They wanted voices that sounded like someone speaking to them, not performing for them. And so, behind the scenes, media executives grew uneasy. Focus groups were held. Communication experts were called in. Strategies were rewritten. Yet nothing seemed to fix the growing disconnect. The problem was never the headlines. It was the delivery. Audiences no longer trusted the tone. What the industry needed was not another dramatic news intro, not faster pacing, not stronger accents, and not louder personalities. It needed warmth. It needed sincerity. It needed a way to speak that felt honest and human. So executives widened their search. They looked beyond broadcasting schools, beyond traditional media training, beyond American communication culture itself. And what they found was unexpected. Not a major media hub, not a well-known speech academy, not a technology giant, but a country many had overlooked. A country known more for hospitality than broadcasting. Yet inside that country, they found an entire workforce trained in a very specific way of communicating. Clear, neutral, easy to understand, but most importantly, empathetic. That place was the Philippines. A nation where communication was not just a technical skill, but a cultural strength. A nation where English was spoken with softness, humility, and heart. And without realizing it, American media was standing at the edge of a turning point. One that would change not just how the news was delivered, but how it felt. The shift had begun. And it started in the most unexpected place. While the rest of the world was busy debating accents, arguing over whose English sounded more correct, and labeling certain speech patterns as prestigious or superior, the Philippines was quietly doing something extraordinary. Not loudly, not competitively, not to prove anything. But because communication in Filipino culture has always been about understanding, not dominance. In offices, classrooms, and training facilities across the country, millions of Filipinos were learning English in a way no other nation had approached it. It was not just about grammar. It was not just about pronunciation. It was not just about sounding Western. It was about becoming universally understood. The Philippines developed one of the world's largest communication training industries, not by accident, but by intention. Companies realized early on that communication could become one of the nation's greatest global strengths, and so, what started as an industry became a science. Call centers expanded into massive campuses. Training programs evolved into full communication systems. Voice coaches developed techniques that blended psychology, clarity, and emotional intelligence. The result? The Philippines became the global capital of human-centered English. And behind that transformation were Filipino voice experts, teachers, linguists, instructors, and communication specialists, training millions of workers to speak English in a way that transcended borders, cultures, and accents. These coaches taught more than correct syllables. They taught intention. They taught presence. They taught emotion. Smile while speaking, they would say, because the person on the other end may not see your face, but they will feel your warmth. Pause, they taught. Not because you forgot what to say, but because silence tells the listener you care about clarity. Use clarity, they reminded, not force. Because the goal is never to dominate a conversation, but to share it. Their approach was revolutionary, because it blended technical skill with humanity. Filipino English was not built for performance, it was built for connection, and those lessons traveled farther than anyone expected. Before long, American companies took notice, then universities, then media groups, then broadcast institutions. American executives asked the same question: why are people more patient, more engaged, and more trusting when the voice sounds Filipino? The answer was simple. Because Filipino communication does not just transfer information, it builds trust. And so, quietly, American broadcasters began hiring Filipino voice trainers. Workshops were held across major news stations, training manuals were rewritten, speech coaching shifted from rigid techniques to relational communication. Anchors who had been trained to sound authoritative began learning how to sound sincere. News reporters practiced breathing patterns. Writers adjusted pacing to allow space for empathy. Television hosts trained to speak with emotion, not just projection. A new philosophy entered American broadcasting, one rooted in warmth, clarity, and connection. And without fanfare or announcement, something extraordinary began. Anchors stopped sounding like machines. They started sounding like people. Listeners did not always know what had changed, but they felt it. Trust began to rebuild. Engagement increased. Retention improved. And inside the industry, a phrase slowly emerged: the Filipino effect. Not a trend, not a coincidence, but a communication revolution born in classrooms and call centers across the Philippines. A revolution built not on grammar or accent, but on empathy. And now, that revolution was reshaping the way America, and perhaps the world, shared its news. Slowly, almost quietly, American news began to sound different. It did not happen overnight. There was no announcement, no headline, no dramatic reveal. But piece by piece, broadcast after broadcast, something shifted. Hard letters softened. Sharp consonants melted into gentler sounds. Sentences once delivered like commands now flowed like thoughtful conversations. The pacing changed. It became calmer, more intentional. Words had room to breathe. Pauses no longer felt like interruptions. They felt like care. Anchors who once sounded like performers rehearsing lines began sounding like real people speaking to other real people. Words like welcome, thank you, and important carried warmth, not just relevance. Announcements felt less like alerts and more like guidance. Even breaking news, once delivered with urgency and tension, no longer sounded like alarm bells. Instead, it sounded like someone saying, "I am here with you. Let's understand this together." And perhaps the most surprising change appeared in the one place no one expected: political reporting. What used to sound combative, arguments, interruptions, forceful emphasis, began shifting toward clarity and respect. The tone transitioned from confrontation to conversation. Some journalists noticed the change immediately. They understood exactly where it came from. They recognized the speech training, the pacing, the gentle inflection. Others had no idea. To them, it felt natural, like the industry had simply evolved. But inside media boardrooms, in training rooms, in broadcast schools, and among communication strategists, one truth began circulating: Filipino English worked. Not as a gimmick, not as a trend, but as a solution to a growing crisis of communication. Audience retention increased. Listening comprehension improved. Engagement rose. And perhaps most importantly, trust returned. People stayed longer. They stopped switching channels. They listened with less resistance and more openness. Because the news no longer sounded cold. It no longer sounded distant. It no longer sounded like a performance or a lecture. It sounded human. And for the first time in years, millions of Americans were hearing a tone that felt familiar. Not because they had heard it before, but because it spoke to something universal, something deeper. A way of communicating grounded not just in clarity, but in connection. And slowly, quietly, beautifully, American media rediscovered its voice. A voice shaped not by power, but by empathy. A voice that, without most people realizing it, carried a subtle warmth from a country across the ocean: the Philippines. And this was only the beginning. One major U.S. network decided to uncover the truth. Behind closed doors, away from public attention and newsroom chatter, executives approved an experiment. Not a marketing test, not a demographic study, but a voice test. Simple on the surface, yet powerful in intention. 2 identical news scripts. Same wording, same tone, same emotional weight. 2 identical studios. Same microphone, same lighting, same quiet room. And 2 voices. The first voice belonged to a traditionally trained American broadcaster, polished, technically perfect, sharp in delivery, and familiar to decades of media norms. The second belonged to a broadcaster trained using Filipino communication principles, steady pacing, gentle clarity, emotional control, and a soft, natural warmth. Nothing else changed. Same timing, same sentences, same message. Only the style of communication differed. Executives expected subtle differences, maybe slightly better clarity, maybe smoother timing, nothing dramatic. But what happened next stunned them. When the recordings were played for audience test groups across multiple states, the results were overwhelming. People did not just hear the difference, they felt it. The Filipino-trained voice was rated as clearer, not because it spoke louder, but because it spoke with precision. It was described as kinder, not because it changed the words, but because it changed the tone. It was called more trustworthy, not because it sounded authoritative, but because it sounded human. And perhaps most surprising of all, listeners stayed fully engaged longer when hearing the Filipino-trained delivery. They leaned in rather than tuning out. They processed information more calmly, and they described the voice as something rare in today's media landscape: comforting. For the first time, industry leaders saw what millions had experienced for years, but never recognized consciously. Filipino English was not simply a regional accent. It was a communication blueprint, a skill set, a philosophy, a strategy rooted in empathy, clarity, and connection. A way of speaking that did not push information onto the listener, but welcomed them into it. That experiment became a turning point. Suddenly, training manuals were rewritten. Voice coaches were reassigned. Production teams began studying not just what was being said, but how it was being delivered. Because now, executives understood. The future of communication would not be defined by volume, perfection, or authority. It would be defined by humanity. And the Philippines had mastered that long before the world realized it mattered. Today, the influence is no longer hidden behind broadcasting curtains or media strategies. It is visible. It is measurable. It is shaping the future of communication. Across the United States, newsrooms now collaborate directly with teams based in Manila. Not as outsourced labor, but as communication partners. Scripts are refined overseas, pronunciation notes are reviewed. Tone guides are crafted by Filipino communication experts who understand not just how to speak, but how to be understood. Universities in America have taken notice as well. Some journalism schools now integrate Filipino speech techniques into their curriculum. Students practice intentional pauses. They learn how to smile through spoken words. They study how empathy can be heard, even when unseen. And as technology advances, the influence grows even stronger. Digital anchors, automated narration systems, and AI voice engines are now being calibrated using Filipino speech rhythms. Software engineers analyze the tone, pacing, and emotional structure of Filipino English, not because it sounds foreign, but because it sounds universally approachable. It is not the accent that makes it special, it is the emotion behind it. Filipino vloggers and creators prove this every day. They go viral not because their English is flawless, but because their delivery feels sincere, like a friend speaking rather than a broadcaster performing. Warm, sincere, inviting. 3 simple qualities, yet powerful enough to build global audiences, loyal communities, and millions of returning listeners. Even artificial intelligence developers are now paying attention. To build voices that sound real, not robotic, they study the Filipino voice. Because AI can replicate grammar, it can replicate fluency, it can replicate pronunciation, but what it struggles to replicate is humanity. And Filipino English has mastered that humanity naturally. In a world rushing toward automation, where voices are digitized and interactions are increasingly screen-based, one question becomes more important than ever. What makes communication feel real? Filipino English holds the answer. It reminds the world that communication is not just sound waves and syllables. It is emotion, intention, connection. It reminds us that a message does not need to be loud to be heard, and it does not need to be perfect to be meaningful. Because, at the core of it all, communication is not a performance, it is a relationship. And in that truth, the Filipino voice stands out. Not as a trend, not as a novelty, but as a model for the future. A future where clarity matters, where kindness matters, where humanity matters. And in that future, one lesson becomes clear. The world does not just want information, it wants connection. And Filipino English has become the voice that delivers both. This shift is bigger than language. It is bigger than accents, teaching methods, or broadcasting trends. Something deeper is happening, a quiet reversal in the flow of influence. For generations, the world looked to the United States as the gold standard of media communication. American anchors set the tone. American broadcasters shaped expectations. American speech became the voice of authority. If you wanted to sound professional, you copied the American tone. If you wanted global recognition, you followed American broadcasting rules. But now, something extraordinary is happening. The direction of influence has changed. Slowly and silently, the student has become the teacher. And the teacher is the Philippines. A country once shaped by foreign education is now shaping how one of the most powerful media systems in the world communicates. It is not loud. It is not forceful. It is not announced with pride or celebration. It is quiet. It is natural. It is earned. And in that silent shift lies a powerful reminder. Communication is not about dominance. It is not about sounding superior. It is not about controlling a conversation. True communication is about connection. It is about being understood. It is about making the listener feel valued. It is about delivering words in a way that respects both message and audience. Filipino English embodies this philosophy. It proves that a voice does not need to be forceful to be heard. It does not need to be aggressive to be respected. It does not need to be perfect to be trusted. Because the world is changing. People are tired of noise. They are tired of pressure. They are tired of voices that demand attention rather than earn it. And so, the communication model that once sat quietly in the background, warm, gentle, human, is now leading the way. Not through power, not through influence, but through heart. The Philippines has shown the world that the most effective voice is not the loudest. It is the one that speaks with empathy. And that simple truth is reshaping how millions listen, speak, and connect, one broadcast at a time. Some experts now believe that within the next decade, Filipino English may become the world's default neutral accent. Not because it mimics American broadcast tone. Not because it follows British structure. Not because it is technically flawless or academically ideal. But because, above all, it sounds kind. Unlike other accents shaped by formality or hierarchy, Filipino English was shaped by something far more powerful: human connection. It is an accent built not from perfection, but from compassion. Not from dominance, but from humility. Not from control, but from respect. Not from the need to speak louder, but from the desire to be understood. Filipino English feels like a conversation, not a performance. It feels welcoming, not intimidating. It feels warm, even through a screen. And that resonance goes beyond grammar, beyond diction, beyond language itself. It reaches something universal. Because long before speech became a science, before accents became status symbols, before broadcasting became competitive, communication was simply one human reaching another. Filipino English carries that spirit. And so, in boardrooms, universities, tech labs, and media rooms around the world, leaders are noticing a truth that once went unseen. The future of communication will not be defined by the most powerful voice, but by the most human one. And that truth transcends geography. It resonates across cultures. It resonates across borders. It resonates across generations. Because kindness never needs translation. Warmth never needs subtitles. And sincerity is understood in every corner of the world. So if the next era of global communication speaks with a voice that feels gentle, clear, and deeply human, it will not be because the world chose effectiveness over identity. It will be because the world finally discovered something the Philippines has known all along. The most powerful way to speak is not to impress someone, but to make them feel seen. More than a century ago, America brought English to the Philippines. At the time, no one could have imagined what that decision would set in motion. No one could have predicted that the language planted in classrooms, communities, and conversations would grow into something the world would one day look to. Not as a reflection of the West, but as a voice uniquely its own. Today, Filipinos are giving it back. Today, Filipinos are giving it back. But it is not the same English. It has evolved. It has softened. It has transformed. It is English shaped by culture, by kindness, and by connection. English spoken not through superiority, but through sincerity. It is gentler. Words feel like invitations rather than instructions. Sentences flow with care rather than urgency. It is warmer. Tone carries gratitude. Pauses carry respect. Delivery carries humanity. It is more human. Not because it is perfect, but because it does not try to be. Filipino English carries not just meaning, but emotion. You can hear patience in its pacing. You can hear consideration in its tone. You can hear empathy woven into every syllable. This is not just language. It is connection in linguistic form. And now, quietly but undeniably, the world is beginning to see the value of that voice. A voice that proves professionalism does not need to sound cold. A voice that proves clarity does not require harshness. A voice that proves communication can inform and comfort at the same time. A voice that reminds us of something we often forget. People do not remember every word we say, but they remember how those words made them feel. And perhaps that is why Filipino English is resonating globally. Because in a time of division, noise, and fast communication, it carries something rare. A tone of humanity. A softness that feels familiar. A warmth that feels safe. A sincerity that feels true. So now, as the world listens more closely, one thing is becoming clear. English may have traveled to the Philippines as a language of instruction, but it is returning to the world as a language of connection. So the next time you turn on your television and hear a calm, steady voice delivering the news, take a moment. Listen, not just to the words, but to the way they are spoken. Notice how the anchor no longer rushes. Notice how the sentences feel thoughtful. Notice how the tone feels less like a broadcast and more like a conversation. Because that voice may sound American. It may carry the professionalism of Western media, the confidence of a modern newsroom, and the structure of traditional broadcasting. But listen closely. There is something more beneath it. Something subtle. Something you do not expect, but cannot ignore. A warmth. A softness. A gentle empathy woven into every line. And that emotional tone does not come from script writing. It does not come from new equipment. It does not come from speaking louder or clearer. It comes from somewhere else. From a culture where communication is an act of care. From a nation where respect lives inside every word. From a voice shaped not by dominance, but by connection. It comes from the Philippines, a country that turned English into something more than vocabulary and structure. A country that transformed a language of instruction into a language of sincerity. A country that taught the world that the greatest power in speaking is not authority, but humanity. Because communication is not just speaking, it is connecting, it is listening, it is feeling, it is understanding, it is heart. And today, in living rooms, digital feeds, podcasts, newsrooms, and AI voices across the world, that heart speaks Filipino. Not loudly, not forcefully, but beautifully, quietly shaping the way the world communicates, one gentle voice at a time. You said,